Vladimir Lenin's left-wing communism, an infantile disorder. No compromises? In the quotation from the Frankfurt pamphlet, we have seen how emphatically the lefts have advanced this slogan. It is sad to see people who no doubt consider themselves Marxists, and want to be Marxists, forget the fundamental truths of Marxism. This is what Engels, who, like Marx, was one of those rarest of authors whose every sentence in every one of their fundamental works contains a remarkably profound content, wrote in 1874, against the manifesto of the 33 Blanquist communards. "We are communists," the Blanquist communards wrote in their manifesto, "because we want to attain our goal without stopping at intermediate stations, without any compromises, which only postpone the day of victory and prolong the period of slavery." The German communists are communists because, through all the intermediate stations and all compromises created, not by them but by the course of historical development, they clearly perceive and constantly pursue the final aim, the abolition of classes and the creation of a society in which there will no longer be private ownership of land or of the means of production. The 33 Blanquists are communists just because they imagine that, merely because they want to skip the intermediate stations and compromises, the matter is settled, and if it begins in the next few days, which they take for granted, and they take over power, communism will be introduced the day after tomorrow. If that is not immediately possible, they are not communists. What childish innocence it is to present one's own impatience as a theoretically convincing argument. Friedrich Engels, Program of the Blanquist Communards, 30, from the German Social Democratic newspaper Volksstadt, 1874, number 73, given in the Russian translation of articles, 1871 to 1875, Petrograd, 1919, pages 52 to 53. In the same article, Engels expresses his profound esteem for Vaillant, and speaks of the unquestionable merit of the latter, who, like St, was one of the most prominent leaders of international socialism until their betrayal of socialism in August 1914. But Engels does not fail to give a detailed analysis of an obvious error. Of course, to very young and inexperienced revolutionaries, as well as to petty bourgeois revolutionaries of even very respectable age and great experience, it seems extremely dangerous, incomprehensible and wrong to permit compromises. Many sophists, being unusually or excessively experienced politicians, reason exactly in the same way as the British leaders of opportunism mentioned by Comrade Lansbury. If the Bolsheviks are permitted a certain compromise, why should we not be permitted any kind of compromise? However, proletarians schooled in numerous strikes, to take only this manifestation of the class struggle, usually assimilate in admirable fashion the very profound truth, philosophical, historical, political and psychological, expounded by Engels. Every proletarian has been through strikes and has experienced compromises with the hated oppressors and exploiters, when the workers have had to return to work either without having achieved anything or else agreeing to only a partial satisfaction of their demands. Every proletarian, as a result of the conditions of the mass struggle and the acute intensification of class antagonisms he lives among, sees the difference between a compromise enforced by objective conditions, such as lack of strike funds, no outside support, starvation and exhaustion, a compromise which in no way minimizes the revolutionary devotion and readiness to carry on the struggle on the part of the workers who have agreed to such a compromise, and, on the other hand, a compromise by traitors who try to ascribe to objective causes their self-interest. Strike breakers also enter into compromises. Their cowardice, desire to toady to the capitalists, and readiness to yield to intimidation, sometimes to persuasion, sometimes to sops, and sometimes to flattery from the capitalists. The history of the British labor movement provides a very large number of instances of such treacherous compromises by British trade union leaders, but, in one form or another, almost all workers in all countries have witnessed the same sort of thing. Naturally, there are individual cases of exceptional difficulty and complexity, when the greatest efforts are necessary for a proper assessment of the actual character of this or that compromise, just as there are cases of homicide when it is by no means easy to establish whether the homicide was fully justified and even necessary, as, for example, legitimate self-defense, or due to unpardonable negligence, or even to a cunningly executed perfidious plan. Of course, in politics, where it is sometimes a matter of extremely complex relations, national and international, between classes and parties, very many cases will arise that will be much more difficult than the question of a legitimate compromise in a strike or a treacherous compromise by a strike breaker, treacherous leader, etc. It would be absurd to formulate a recipe or general rule, no compromises, to suit all cases. One must use one's own brains and be able to find one's bearings in each particular instance. It is, in fact, one of the functions of a party organization and of party leaders worthy of the name, to acquire, through the prolonged, persistent, variegated and comprehensive efforts of all thinking representatives of a given class, the knowledge, experience and, in addition to knowledge and experience, the political flair necessary for the speedy and correct solution of complex political problems. 30. Naive and quite inexperienced people imagine that the permissibility of compromise in general is sufficient to obliterate any distinction between opportunism, against which we are waging, and must wage, an unremitting struggle, and revolutionary Marxism, or communism. But if such people do not yet know that in nature and in society all distinctions are fluid and up to a certain point conventional, nothing can help them but lengthy training, education, enlightenment, and political and everyday experience. In the practical questions that arise in the politics of any particular or specific historical moment, it is important to single out those which display the principal type of intolerable and treacherous compromises, such as embody an opportunism that is fatal to the revolutionary class, and to exert all efforts to explain them and combat them. During the 1914–18 imperialist war between two groups of equally predatory countries, social chauvinism was the principal and fundamental type of opportunism, that is, support of defense of country, which in such a war was really equivalent to defense of the predatory interests of one's own bourgeoisie. After the war, defense of the robber League of Nations, 31, defense of direct or indirect alliances with the bourgeoisie of one's own country against the revolutionary proletariat and the Soviet movement, and defense of bourgeois democracy and bourgeois parliamentarism against Soviet power became the principal manifestations of those intolerable and treacherous compromises, whose sum total constituted an opportunism fatal to the revolutionary proletariat and its cause. All compromise with other parties. Any policy of maneuvering and compromise must be emphatically rejected. The German left's right in the Frankfurt pamphlet. It is surprising that, with such views, these lefts do not emphatically condemn Bolshevism. After all, the German lefts cannot but know that the entire history of Bolshevism, both before and after the October Revolution, is full of instances of changes of tack, conciliatory tactics and compromises with other parties, including bourgeois parties. To carry on a war for the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie, a war which is 100 times more difficult, protracted and complex than the most stubborn of ordinary wars between states, and to renounce in advance any change of tack, or any utilization of a conflict of interests, even if temporary, among one's enemies, or any conciliation or compromise with possible allies, even if they are temporary, unstable, vacillating or conditional allies, is that not ridiculous in the extreme? Is it not like making a difficult ascent of an unexplored and hitherto inaccessible mountain and refusing in advance ever to move in zigzags, ever to retrace one's steps, or ever to abandon a course once selected, and to try others? And yet people so immature and inexperienced, if youth were the explanation, it would not be so bad. Young people are preordained to talk such nonsense for a certain period, have met with support, whether direct or indirect, open or covert, whole or partial, it does not matter, from some members of the Communist Party of Holland. After the first socialist revolution of the proletariat, and the overthrow of the bourgeoisie in some country, the proletariat of that country remains for a long time weaker than the bourgeoisie, simply because of the latter's extensive international links, and also because of the spontaneous and continuous restoration and regeneration of capitalism and the bourgeoisie by the small commodity producers of the country which has overthrown the bourgeoisie. The more powerful enemy can be vanquished only by exerting the utmost effort, and by the most thorough, careful, attentive, skillful and obligatory use of any, even the smallest, rift between the enemies, any conflict of interests among the bourgeoisie of the various countries and among the various groups or types of bourgeoisie within the various countries, and also by taking advantage of any, even the smallest, opportunity of winning a mass ally, even though this ally is temporary, vacillating, unstable, unreliable and conditional. Those who do not understand this reveal a failure to understand even the smallest grain of Marxism, of modern scientific socialism in general. Those who have not proved in practice, over a fairly considerable period of time and in fairly varied political situations, their ability to apply this truth in practice have not yet learned to help the revolutionary class in its struggle to emancipate all toiling humanity from the exploiters. And this applies equally to the period before and after the proletariat has won political power. Our theory is not a dogma, but a guide to action, said Marx and Engels. 32. The greatest blunder, the greatest crime, committed by such out-and-out Marxists as Karl Kautsky, Otto Bauer, etc., is that they have not understood this and have been unable to apply it at crucial moments of the proletarian revolution. Political activity is not like the pavement of Nevsky Prospect, the well-kept, broad and level pavement of the perfectly straight principal thoroughfare of St. Petersburg. N. G. Chernyshevsky, the great Russian socialist of the pre-Marxist period, used to say. Since Chernyshevsky's time, disregard or forgetfulness of this truth has cost Russian revolutionaries countless sacrifices. We must strive at all costs to prevent the left communists and West European and American revolutionaries that are devoted to the working class from paying as dearly as the backward Russians did to learn this truth. Prior to the downfall of Tsarism, the Russian revolutionary Social Democrats made repeated use of the services of the bourgeois liberals, that is, they concluded numerous practical compromises with the latter. In 1901–02, even prior to the appearance of Bolshevism, the old editorial board of Iskra, consisting of Plekhanov, Axelrod, Zaslik, Mardov, Patrusov and myself, concluded, not for long, it is true, a formal political alliance with Struve, the political leader of bourgeois liberalism, while at the same time being able to wage an unremitting and most merciless ideological and political struggle against bourgeois liberalism and against the slightest manifestation of its influence in the working class movement. The Bolsheviks have always adhered to this policy. Since 1905 they have systematically advocated an alliance between the working class and the peasantry, against the liberal bourgeoisie and Tsarism, never, however, refusing to support the bourgeoisie against Tsarism, for instance, during second rounds of elections, or during second ballots, and never ceasing their relentless ideological and political struggle against the socialist revolutionaries, the bourgeois Revolutionary Peasant Party, exposing them as petty bourgeois Democrats who have falsely described themselves as socialists. During the Duma elections of 1907, the Bolsheviks entered briefly into a formal political bloc with the socialist revolutionaries. Between 1903 and 1912, there were periods of several years in which we were formally united with the Mensheviks in a single social democratic party, but we never stopped our ideological and political struggle against them as opportunists and vehicles of bourgeois influence on the proletariat. During the war, we concluded certain compromises with the Trotskyites, with the left Mensheviks, Mardov, and with a section of the socialist revolutionaries, Chernov and Natanson. We were together with them at Zimmerwald and Infantile, 33, and issued joint manifestos. However, we never ceased and never relaxed our ideological and political struggle against the Trotskyites, Mardov and Chernov. When Natanson died in 1919, a revolutionary communist Narodnik, 34, he was very close to and almost in agreement with us. At the very moment of the October Revolution, we entered into an informal but very important, and very successful, political bloc with the petty bourgeois peasantry by adopting the socialist revolutionary agrarian program in its entirety, without a single alteration. That is, we effected an undeniable compromise in order to prove to the peasants that we wanted, not to steamroller them but to reach agreement with them. At the same time we proposed, and soon after effected, a formal political bloc, including participation in the government, with the left socialist revolutionaries, who dissolved this bloc after the conclusion of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and then, in July 1918, went to the length of armed rebellion, and subsequently of an armed struggle, against us. It is therefore understandable why the attacks made by the German lefts against the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Germany for entertaining the idea of a bloc with the independents, the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, the Trotskyites, are absolutely inane, in our opinion, and clear proof that the lefts are in the wrong. In Russia, too, there were right Mensheviks, participants in the Kerensky government, who corresponded to the German Sidemans, and left Mensheviks, Mardov, corresponding to the German Trotskyites and standing in opposition to the right Mensheviks. A gradual shift of the worker masses from the Mensheviks over to the Bolsheviks was to be clearly seen in 1917. At the First All-Russia Congress of Soviets, held in June 1917, we had only 13% of the votes. The Socialist Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks had a majority. At the Second Congress of Soviets, October 25, 1917, old style, we had 51% of the votes. Why is it that in Germany the same and absolutely identical shift of the workers from right to left did not immediately strengthen the communists, but first strengthened the Midway Independent Party, although the latter never had independent political ideas or an independent policy, but merely wavered between the Sidemans and the Communists? One of the evident reasons was the erroneous tactics of the German Communists, who must fearlessly and honestly admit this error and learn to rectify it. The error consisted in their denial of the need to take part in the reactionary bourgeois parliaments and in the reactionary trade unions. The error consisted in numerous manifestations of that left-wing infantile disorder which has now come to the surface and will consequently be cured the more thoroughly, the more rapidly and with greater advantage to the organism. The German Independent Social Democratic Party is obviously not a homogeneous body. Alongside the old opportunist leaders, Kautsky, Hilferding and apparently, to a considerable extent, Crispian, Lederer and others, these have revealed their inability to understand the significance of Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and their inability to lead the proletariat's revolutionary struggle. There has emerged in this party a left and proletarian wing, which is growing most rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of members of this party, which has, I think, a membership of some 750,000, are proletarians who are abandoning Sidemen and are rapidly going over to communism. This proletarian wing has already proposed, at the Leipzig Congress of the Independents, 1919, immediate and unconditional affiliation to the Third International. To fear a compromise with this wing of the party is positively ridiculous. On the contrary, it is the duty of communists to seek and find a suitable form of compromise with them, a compromise which, on the one hand, will facilitate and accelerate the necessary complete fusion with this wing and, on the other, will in no way hamper the communists in their ideological and political struggle against the opportunist right wing of the independents. It will probably be no easy matter to devise a suitable form of compromise, but only a charlatan could promise the German workers and the German communists an easy road to victory. Capitalism would not be capitalism if the proletariat per se were not surrounded by a large number of exceedingly motley types intermediate between the proletarian and the semi-proletarian, who earns his livelihood in part by the sale of his labor power, between the semi-proletarian and the small peasant, and petty artisan, handicraft worker and small master in general, between the small peasant and the middle peasant, and so on. And if the proletariat itself were not divided into more developed and less developed strata, if it were not divided according to territorial origin, trade, sometimes according to religion, and so on. From all this follows the necessity, the absolute necessity, for the Communist Party, the vanguard of the proletariat, its class-conscious section, to resort to changes of tack, to conciliation and compromises with the various groups of proletarians, with the various parties of the workers and small masters. It is entirely a matter of knowing how to apply these tactics in order to raise, not lower, the general level of proletarian class consciousness, revolutionary spirit, and ability to fight and win. Incidentally, It should be noted that the Bolsheviks' victory over the Mensheviks called for the application of tactics of changes of tack, conciliation and compromises, not only before but also after the October Revolution of 1917, but the changes of tack and compromises were, of course, such as assisted, boosted and consolidated the Bolsheviks at the expense of the Mensheviks. The petty bourgeois Democrats, including the Mensheviks, inevitably vacillate between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between bourgeois democracy and the Soviet system, between reformism and revolutionism, between love for the workers and fear of the proletarian dictatorship, etc. The Communists' proper tactics should consist in utilizing these vacillations, not ignoring them. Utilizing them calls for concessions to elements that are turning towards the proletariat, whenever and in the measure that they turn towards the proletariat, in addition to fighting those who turn towards the bourgeoisie. As a result of the application of the correct tactics, Menshevism began to disintegrate, and has been disintegrating more and more in our country. The stubbornly opportunist leaders are being isolated, and the best of the workers and the best elements among the petty bourgeois Democrats are being brought into our camp. This is a lengthy process, and the hasty decision, no compromises, no maneuvers can only prejudice the strengthening of the revolutionary proletariat's influence and the enlargement of its forces. Lastly, one of the undoubted errors of the German lefts lies in their downright refusal to recognize the Treaty of Versailles. The more weightily and pompously, the more emphatically and peremptorily this viewpoint is formulated, by K. Horner, for instance, the less sense it seems to make. It is not enough, under the present conditions of the international proletarian revolution, to repudiate the preposterous absurdities of National Bolshevism, Laufenberg and others, which has gone to the length of advocating a bloc with the German bourgeoisie for a war against the Entente. One must realize that it is utterly false tactics to refuse to admit that a Soviet Germany, if a German Soviet Republic were soon to arise, would have to recognize the Treaty of Versailles for a time, and to submit to it. From this it does not follow that the independents, at a time when the Siedemans were in the government, when the Soviet government in Hungary had not yet been overthrown, and when it was still possible that a Soviet revolution in Vienna would support Soviet Hungary, were right, under the circumstances, in putting forward the demand that the Treaty of Versailles should be signed. At that time the independents tacked and maneuvered very clumsily, for they more or less accepted responsibility for the Siedeman traitors, and more or less backslid from advocacy of a ruthless, and most calmly conducted, class war against the Siedemans, to advocacy of a classless or above-class standpoint. In the present situation, however, the German Communists should obviously not deprive themselves of freedom of action by giving a positive and categorical promise to repudiate the Treaty of Versailles in the event of Communism's victory. That would be absurd. They should say, the Siedemans and the Trotskyites have committed a number of acts of treachery hindering, and in part quite ruining, the chances of an alliance with Soviet Russia and Soviet Hungary. We Communists will do all we can to facilitate and pave the way for such an alliance. However, we are in no way obligated to repudiate the Treaty of Versailles, come what may, or to do so at once. The possibility of its successful repudiation will depend, not only on the German, but also on the international successes of the Soviet movement. The Siedemans and the Trotskyites have hampered this movement, we are helping it. That is the gist of the matter, therein lies the fundamental difference. And if our class enemies, the exploiters and their Siedeman and Trotskyite lackeys, have missed many an opportunity of strengthening both the German and the international Soviet movement, of strengthening both the German and the international Soviet revolution, the blame lies with them. The Soviet revolution in Germany will strengthen the international Soviet movement, which is the strongest bulwark, and the only reliable, invincible and worldwide bulwark, against the Treaty of Versailles and against international imperialism in general. To give absolute, categorical and immediate precedence to liberation from the Treaty of Versailles and to give it precedence over the question of liberating other countries oppressed by imperialism, from the yoke of imperialism, is Philistine nationalism, worthy of the Kotskys, the Hilferdings, the Otto Bauers and co., not revolutionary internationalism. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie in any of the large European countries, including Germany, would be such a gain for the international revolution that, for its sake, one can, and if necessary should, tolerate a more prolonged existence of the Treaty of Versailles. If Russia, standing alone, could endure the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk for several months, to the advantage of the revolution, there is nothing impossible in a Soviet Germany, allied with Soviet Russia, enduring the existence of the Treaty of Versailles for a longer period, to the advantage of the revolution. The imperialists of France, Britain, etc., are trying to provoke and ensnare the German communists, say that you will not sign the Treaty of Versailles. They urge. Like babes, the left communists fall into the trap laid for them, instead of skillfully maneuvering against the crafty and, at present, stronger enemy, and instead of telling him, we shall sign the Treaty of Versailles now. It is folly, not revolutionism, to deprive ourselves in advance of any freedom of action, openly to inform an enemy who is at present better armed than we are whether we shall fight him, and when. To accept battle at a time when it is obviously advantageous to the enemy, but not to us, is criminal. Political leaders of the revolutionary class are absolutely useless if they are incapable of changing tack, or offering conciliation and compromise in order to take evasive action in a patently disadvantageous battle. Left-wing communism in Great Britain. There is no communist party in Great Britain as yet, but there is a fresh, broad, powerful and rapidly growing communist movement among the workers, which justifies the best hopes. There are several political parties and organizations: the British Socialist Party, 35, the Socialist Labour Party, the South Wales Socialist Society, the Workers' Socialist Federation, 36, which desire to form a communist party and are already negotiating among themselves to this end. In its issue of February 21, 1920, Volume 6, Number 48, the Workers' Dreadnought, weekly organ of the last of the organizations mentioned, carried an article by the editor, Comrade Sylvia Pankhurst, entitled Towards a Communist Party. The article outlines the progress of the negotiations between the four organizations mentioned, for the formation of a united communist party, on the basis of affiliation to the Third International, the recognition of the Soviet system instead of parliamentarianism, and the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It appears that one of the greatest obstacles to the immediate formation of a united communist party is presented by the disagreement on the questions of participation in parliament and on whether the new communist party should affiliate to the old, trade unionist, opportunist and social chauvinist Labour Party, which is mostly made up of trade unions. The Workers' Socialist Federation and the Socialist Labour Party 7 are opposed to taking part in parliamentary elections and in parliament, and they are opposed to affiliation to the Labour Party. In this they disagree with all or with most of the members of the British Socialist Party, which they regard as the right wing of the communist parties in Great Britain. Page 5, Sylvia Pankhurst's article. Thus, the main division is the same as in Germany, notwithstanding the enormous difference in the forms in which the disagreements manifest themselves. In Germany the form is far closer to the Russian than it is in Great Britain, and in a number of other things. Let us examine the arguments of the lefts. On the question of participation in Parliament, Comrade Sylvia Pankhurst refers to an article in the same issue, by Comrade Gallagher, who writes in the name of the Scottish Workers' Council in Glasgow. The above council, he writes, is definitely anti-parliamentarian, and has behind it the left wing of the various political bodies. We represent the revolutionary movement in Scotland, striving continually to build up a revolutionary organization within the industries, in various branches of production, and a communist party, based on social committees, throughout the country. For a considerable time we have been sparring with the official parliamentarians. We have not considered it necessary to declare open warfare on them, and they are afraid to open an attack on us. But this state of affairs cannot long continue. We are winning all along the line. The rank and file of the ILP in Scotland is becoming more and more disgusted with the thought of Parliament, and the Soviets, the Russian word transliterated into English is used, or workers' councils are being supported by almost every branch. This is very serious, of course, for the gentlemen who look to politics for a profession, and they are using any and every means to persuade their members to come back into the parliamentary fold. Revolutionary comrades must not, all italics are the authors, give any support to this gang. Our fight here is going to be a difficult one. One of the worst features of it will be the treachery of those whose personal ambition is a more impelling force than their regard for the revolution. Any support given to parliamentarism is simply assisting to put power into the hands of our British sidemans and Nosks. Henderson, Kleins and company are hopelessly reactionary. The official ILP is more and more coming under the control of middle-class liberals, who have found their spiritual home in the camp of Messrs. MacDonald, Snowden and company. The official ILP is bitterly hostile to the Third International, the rank and file is for it. Any support to the parliamentary opportunists is simply playing into the hands of the former. The BSP doesn't count at all here. What is wanted here is a sound revolutionary industrial organization, and a communist party working along clear, well-defined, scientific lines. If our comrades can assist us in building these, we will take their help gladly. If they cannot, for God's sake let them keep out altogether, lest they betray the revolution by lending their support to the reactionaries, who are so eagerly clamoring for parliamentary honors. The query mark is the authors, and who are so anxious to prove that they can rule as effectively as the boss-class politicians themselves. In my opinion, this letter to the editor expresses excellently the temper and point of view of the young communists, or of rank-and-file workers who are only just beginning to accept communism. This temper is highly gratifying and valuable. We must learn to appreciate and support it, for, in its absence, it would be hopeless to expect the victory of the proletarian revolution in Great Britain, or in any other country for that matter. People who can give expression to this temper of the masses, and are able to evoke such a temper, which is very often dormant, unconscious and latent, among the masses, should be appreciated and given every assistance. At the same time, we must tell them openly and frankly that a state of mind is by itself insufficient for leadership of the masses in a great revolutionary struggle, and that the cause of the revolution may well be harmed by certain errors that people who are most devoted to the cause of the revolution are about to commit, or are committing. Comrade Gallagher's letter undoubtedly reveals the rudiments of all the mistakes that are being made by the German left communists and were made by the Russian left Bolsheviks in 1908 and 1918. The writer of the letter is full of a noble and working-class hatred for the bourgeois class politicians, a hatred understood and shared, however, not only by proletarians but by all working people, by all Kleinluden, to use the German expression. In a representative of the oppressed and exploited masses, this hatred is truly the beginning of all wisdom, the basis of any socialist and communist movement and of its success. The writer, however, has apparently lost sight of the fact that politics is a science and an art that does not fall from the skies or come gratis, and that, if it wants to overcome the bourgeoisie, the proletariat must train its own proletarian class politicians, of a kind in no way inferior to bourgeois politicians. The writer of the letter fully realizes that only workers' soviets, not parliament, can be the instrument enabling the proletariat to achieve its aims. Those who have failed to understand this are, of course, out-and-out reactionaries, even if they are most highly educated people, most experienced politicians, most sincere socialists, most erudite Marxists, and most honest citizens and fathers of families. But the writer of the letter does not even ask, it does not occur to him to ask, whether it is possible to bring about the Soviets' victory over Parliament without getting pro-Soviet politicians into Parliament, without disintegrating parliamentarianism from within, without working within Parliament for the success of the Soviets in their forthcoming task of dispersing Parliament. Yet the writer of the letter expresses the absolutely correct idea that the Communist Party in Great Britain must act on scientific principles. Science demands, first, that the experience of other countries be taken into account, especially if these other countries, which are also capitalist, are undergoing, or have recently undergone, a very similar experience. Second, it demands that account be taken of all the forces, groups, parties, classes and masses operating in a given country, and also that policy should not be determined only by the desires and views, by the degree of class consciousness and the militancy of one group or party alone, It is true that the Hendersons, the Kleineses, the MacDonalds and the Snowdens are hopelessly reactionary. It is equally true that they want to assume power, though they would prefer a coalition with the bourgeoisie, that they want to rule along the old bourgeois lines, and that when they are in power they will certainly behave like the Seidmans and Nosks. All that is true. But it does not at all follow that to support them means treachery to the revolution. What does follow is that, in the interests of the revolution, working-class revolutionaries should give these gentlemen a certain amount of parliamentary support. To explain this idea, I shall take two contemporary British political documents. 1. The speech delivered by Prime Minister Lloyd George on March 18, 1920, as reported in the Manchester Guardian of March 19, 1920, and, 2. The arguments of a left communist, Comrade Sylvia Pankhurst, in the article mentioned above. In his speech Lloyd George entered into a polemic with Asquith, who had been especially invited to this meeting but declined to attend, and with those liberals who want, not a coalition with the Conservatives, but closer relations with the Labour Party. In the above-quoted letter, Comrade Gallagher also points to the fact that liberals are joining the Independent Labour Party. Lloyd George argued that a coalition, and a close coalition at that, between the Liberals and the Conservatives was essential, otherwise there might be a victory for the Labour Party, which Lloyd George prefers to call socialist and which is working for the common ownership of the means of production. It is known as communism in France, the leader of the British bourgeoisie said, putting it popularly for his audience, liberal MPs who probably never knew it before. In Germany it was called socialism, and in Russia it is called Bolshevism, he went on to say. To liberals this is unacceptable on principle, Lloyd George explained, because they stand in principle for private property. Civilization is in jeopardy, the speaker declared, and consequently liberals and conservatives must unite. If you go to the agricultural areas, said Lloyd George, I agree you have the old party divisions as strong as ever. They are removed from the danger. It does not walk their lanes. But when they see it they will be as strong as some of these industrial constituencies are now. 4/5 of this country is industrial and commercial. Hardly 1/5 is agricultural. It is one of the things I have constantly in my mind when I think of the dangers of the future here. In France the population is agricultural, and you have a solid body of opinion which does not move very rapidly, and which is not very easily excited by revolutionary movements. That is not the case here. This country is more top-heavy than any country in the world, and if it begins to rock, the crash here, for that reason, will be greater than in any land. From this the reader will see that Mr. Lloyd George is not only a very intelligent man, but one who has also learned a great deal from the Marxists. We too have something to learn from Lloyd George. Of definite interest is the following episode, which occurred in the course of the discussion after Lloyd George's speech. Mr. Wallace, MP, I should like to ask what the Prime Minister considers the effect might be in the industrial constituencies upon the industrial workers, so many of whom are liberals at the present time and from whom we get so much support. Would not a possible result be to cause an immediate overwhelming accession of strength to the Labour Party from men who at present are our cordial supporters? The Prime Minister, I take a totally different view. The fact that liberals are fighting among themselves undoubtedly drives a very considerable number of liberals in despair to the Labour Party, where you get a considerable body of liberals, very able men, whose business it is to discredit the government. The result is undoubtedly to bring a good accession of public sentiment to the Labour Party. It does not go to the liberals who are outside, it goes to the Labour Party. The by-elections show that. It may be said, in passing, that this argument shows in particular how muddled even the most intelligent members of the bourgeoisie have become and how they cannot help committing irreparable blunders. That, in fact, is what will bring about the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Our people, however, may commit blunders, provided, of course, that they are not too serious and are rectified in time, and yet in the long run, will prove the victors. The second political document is the following argument advanced by Comrade Sylvia Pankhurst, a left communist. Comrade Inkpen, the General Secretary of the British Socialist Party, refers to the Labour Party as the main body of the working class movement. Another comrade of the British Socialist Party, at the Third International, just held, put the British Socialist Party position more strongly. He said, "We regard the Labour Party as the organised working class. We do not take this view of the Labour Party. The Labour Party is very large numerically, though its membership is to a great extent quiescent and apathetic, consisting of men and women who have joined the trade unions because their workmates are trade unionists, and to share the friendly benefits. But we recognizes that the great size of the Labour Party is also due to the fact that it is the creation of a school of thought beyond which the majority of the British working class has not yet emerged, though great changes are at work in the mind of the people which will presently alter this state of affairs. The British Labour Party, like the social patriotic organizations of other countries, will, in the natural development of society, inevitably come into power. It is for the Communists to build up the forces that will overthrow the social patriots, and in this country we must not delay or falter in that work. We must not dissipate our energy in adding to the strength of the Labour Party. Its rise to power is inevitable. We must concentrate on making a communist movement that will vanquish it. The Labour Party will soon be forming a government, the revolutionary opposition must make ready to attack it. Thus the liberal bourgeoisie are abandoning the historical system of two parties, of exploiters, which has been hallowed by centuries of experience and has been extremely advantageous to the exploiters, and consider it necessary for these two parties to join forces against the Labour Party. A number of liberals are deserting to the Labour Party like rats from a sinking ship. The left communists believe that the transfer of power to the Labour Party is inevitable and admit that it now has the backing of most workers. From this they draw the strange conclusion which Comrade Sylvia Pankhurst formulates as follows. The Communist Party must not compromise. The Communist Party must keep its doctrine pure, and its independence of reformism inviolate. Its mission is to lead the way, without stopping or turning, by the direct road to the communist revolution. On the contrary, the fact that most British workers still follow the lead of the British Kerenskys or sidemans and have not yet had experience of a government composed of these people, an experience which was necessary in Russia and Germany so as to secure the mass transition of the workers to communism, undoubtedly indicates that the British communists should participate in parliamentary action, that they should, from within Parliament, help the masses of the workers see the results of a Henderson and Snowden government in practice, and that they should help the Hendersons and Snowdens defeat the united forces of Lloyd George and Churchill. To act otherwise would mean hampering the cause of the revolution, since revolution is impossible without a change in the views of the majority of the working class, a change brought about by the political experience of the masses, never by propaganda alone. To lead the way without compromises, without turning, this slogan is obviously wrong if it comes from a patently impotent minority of the workers who know, or at all events should know, that given a Henderson and Snowden victory over Lloyd George and Churchill, the majority will soon become disappointed in their leaders and will begin to support communism, or at all events will adopt an attitude of neutrality, and, in the main, of sympathetic neutrality, towards the communists. It is as though 10,000 soldiers were to hurl themselves into battle against an enemy force of 50,000, when it would be proper to halt, take evasive action, or even effect a compromise so as to gain time until the arrival of the 100,000 reinforcements that are on their way but cannot go into action immediately. That is intellectualist childishness, not the serious tactics of a revolutionary class. The fundamental law of revolution, which has been confirmed by all revolutions and especially by all three Russian revolutions in the 20th century, is as follows. For a revolution to take place, it is not enough for the exploited and oppressed masses to realize the impossibility of living in the old way, and demand changes. For a revolution to take place, it is essential that the exploiters should not be able to live and rule in the old way. It is only when the lower classes do not want to live in the old way and the upper classes cannot carry on in the old way that the revolution can triumph. This truth can be expressed in other words: revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis, affecting both the exploited and the exploiters. It follows that, for a revolution to take place, it is essential, first, that a majority of the workers, or at least a majority of the class conscious, thinking, and politically active workers should fully realize that revolution is necessary, and that they should be prepared to die for it. Second, that the ruling classes should be going through a governmental crisis, which draws even the most backward masses into politics. Symptomatic of any genuine revolution is a rapid, tenfold and even hundredfold increase in the size of the working and oppressed masses, hitherto apathetic, who are capable of waging the political struggle, weakens the government, and makes it possible for the revolutionaries to rapidly overthrow it. Incidentally, as can also be seen from Lloyd George's speech, both conditions for a successful proletarian revolution are clearly maturing in Great Britain. The errors of the left communists are particularly dangerous at present, because certain revolutionaries are not displaying a sufficiently thoughtful, sufficiently attentive, sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently shrewd attitude toward each of these conditions. If we are the party of the revolutionary class, and not merely a revolutionary group, and if we want the masses to follow us, and unless we achieve that, we stand the risk of remaining mere windbags, we must, first, help Henderson or Snowden to beat Lloyd George and Churchill, or, rather, compel the former to beat the latter, because the former are afraid of their victory. Second, we must help the majority of the working class to be convinced by their own experience that we are right, that is, that the Hendersons and Snowdens are absolutely good for nothing, that they are petty bourgeois and treacherous by nature, and that their bankruptcy is inevitable. Third, we must bring nearer the moment when, on the basis of the disappointment of most of the workers in the Hendersons, it will be possible, with serious chances of success, to overthrow the government of the Hendersons at once, because if the most astute and solid Lloyd George, that big, not petty, bourgeois, is displaying consternation and is more and more weakening himself, and the bourgeoisie as a whole, by his friction with Churchill today and with Asquith tomorrow, how much greater will be the consternation of a Henderson government? I will put it more concretely. In my opinion, the British Communists should unite their four parties and groups, all very weak, and some of them very, very weak, into a single Communist Party on the basis of the principles of the Third International and of obligatory participation in Parliament. The Communist Party should propose the following compromise election agreement to the Hendersons and Snowdens: let us jointly fight against the alliance between Lloyd George and the Conservatives, let us share parliamentary seats in proportion to the number of workers' votes polled for the Labour Party and for the Communist Party, not in elections, but in a special ballot, and let us retain complete freedom of agitation, propaganda and political activity. Of course, without this latter condition, we cannot agree to a bloc, for that would be treachery. The British Communists must demand and get complete freedom to expose the Hendersons and the Snowdens in the same way as, for 15 years, 1903 to 17, the Russian Bolsheviks demanded and got it in respect of the Russian Hendersons and Snowdens, that is, the Mensheviks. If the Hendersons and the Snowdens accept a bloc on these terms, we shall be the gainers, because the number of parliamentary seats is of no importance to us, we are not out for seats. We shall yield on this point, whilst the Hendersons and especially their new friends, or new masters the Liberals who have joined the Independent Labour Party are most eager to get seats. We shall be the gainers, because we shall carry our agitation among the masses at a time when Lloyd George himself has incensed them, and we shall not only be helping the Labour Party to establish its government sooner, but shall also be helping the masses sooner to understand the communist propaganda that we shall carry on against the Hendersons, without any reticence or remission. If the Hendersons and the Snowdens reject a bloc with us on these terms, we shall gain still more, for we shall at once have shown the masses, note that, even in the purely Menshevik and completely opportunist Independent Labour Party, the rank and file are in favor of Soviets, that the Hendersons prefer their close relations with the capitalists to the unity of all the workers. We shall immediately gain in the eyes of the masses, who, particularly after the brilliant, highly correct and highly useful, to communism, explanations given by Lloyd George, will be sympathetic to the idea of uniting all the workers against the Lloyd George Conservative alliance. We shall gain immediately, because we shall have demonstrated to the masses that the Hendersons and the Snowdens are afraid to beat Lloyd George, afraid to assume power alone, and are striving to secure the secret support of Lloyd George, who is openly extending a hand to the conservatives, against the Labour Party. It should be noted that in Russia, after the Revolution of February 27, 1917, old style, the Bolsheviks' propaganda against the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, that is, the Russian Hendersons and Snowdens, derived benefit precisely from a circumstance of this kind. We said to the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, assume full power without the bourgeoisie, because you have a majority in the Soviets. At the first All-Russia Congress of Soviets, in June 1917, the Bolsheviks had only 13% of the votes. But the Russian Hendersons and Snowdens were afraid to assume power without the bourgeoisie, and when the bourgeoisie held up the elections to the Constituent Assembly, knowing full well that the elections would give a majority to the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks 8-2 formed a closed political bloc and in fact represented only petty bourgeois democracy, the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks were unable energetically and consistently to oppose these delays. If the Hendersons and the Snowdens reject a bloc with the Communists, the latter will immediately gain by winning the sympathy of the masses and discrediting the Hendersons and Snowdens. If, as a result, we do lose a few parliamentary seats, it is a matter of no significance to us. We would put up our candidates in a very few but absolutely safe constituencies, namely, constituencies where our candidatures would not give any seats to the Liberals at the expense of the Labour candidates. We would take part in the election campaign, distribute leaflets agitating for communism, and, in all constituencies where we have no candidates, we would urge the electors to vote for the Labour candidate and against the bourgeois candidate. Comrades Sylvia Pankhurst and Gallagher are mistaken in thinking that this is a betrayal of communism, or a renunciation of the struggle against the social traitors. On the contrary, the cause of communist revolution would undoubtedly gain thereby. At present, British communists very often find it hard even to approach the masses, and even to get a hearing from them. If I come out as a communist and call upon them to vote for Henderson and against Lloyd George, they will certainly give me a hearing. And I shall be able to explain in a popular manner, not only why the Soviets are better than a parliament and why the dictatorship of the proletariat is better than the dictatorship of Churchill, disguised with the signboard of bourgeois democracy, but also that, with my vote, I want to support Henderson in the same way as the rope supports a hanged man, that the impending establishment of a government of the Hendersons will prove that I am right, will bring the masses over to my side, and will hasten the political death of the Hendersons and the Snowdens just as was the case with their kindred spirits in Russia and Germany. If the objection is raised that these tactics are too subtle or too complex for the masses to understand, that these tactics will split and scatter our forces, will prevent us from concentrating them on Soviet revolution, etc., I will reply to the left objectors, don't ascribe your doctrinarism to the masses. The masses in Russia are no doubt no better educated than the masses in Britain, if anything, they are less so. Yet the masses understood the Bolsheviks, and the fact that, in September 1917, on the eve of the Soviet Revolution, the Bolsheviks put up their candidates for a bourgeois parliament, the Constituent Assembly, and on the day after the Soviet Revolution, in November 1917, took part in the elections to this Constituent Assembly, which they got rid of on January 5, 1918. This did not hamper the Bolsheviks, but, on the contrary, helped them. I cannot deal here with the second point of disagreement among the British Communists, the question of affiliation or non-affiliation to the Labour Party. I have too little material at my disposal on this question, which is highly complex because of the unique character of the British Labour Party, whose very structure is so unlike that of the political parties usual in the European continent. It is beyond doubt, however, first, that in this question, too, those who try to deduce the tactics of the revolutionary proletariat from principles such as, the Communist Party must keep its doctrine pure, and its independence of reformism inviolate, its mission is to lead the way, without stopping or turning, by the direct road to the communist revolution will inevitably fall into error. Such principles are merely a repetition of the mistake made by the French Blanquist communards, who, in 1874, repudiated all compromises and all intermediate stages. Second, it is beyond doubt that, in this question too, As always, the task consists in learning to apply the general and basic principles of communism to the specific relations between classes and parties, to the specific features in the objective development towards communism, which are different in each country and which we must be able to discover, study, and predict. This, however, should be discussed, not in connection with British communism alone, but in connection with the general conclusions concerning the development of communism in all capitalist countries. We shall now proceed to deal with this subject.